Hello, world. My name is Hristina Crenn. Today, I have the privilege to talk with Jennifer Repa, more precisely, Miss Jennifer Repa, all the way from the States. Hello, how are you doing today?
I'm doing well. How are you?
I'm doing well, thank you. You are a water quality specialist.
Yes,
Could you please briefly present yourself and tell us more about your professional background?
sure. Well, I started off with a bachelor's in psychology from St. Louis University, and I wasn't quite sure what I wanted to do with my professional life from there. So I bounced around to a couple different professions and decided to go back to school and took some biology courses in Greensboro, North Carolina, and actually applied for the environmental science graduate school at Christopher Newport University. So I now have my master's in environmental science, and my thesis work concentrated on stormwater and how different, I guess, how effective wetlands are at filtering nutrients and other contaminants out of our stormwater. So for the past 7 years, I've lived in California, and I've worked for an environmental consulting agency here. And I've done work with a couple different types of water quality, but my main focus the past 4 or 5 years has been on stormwater quality, how various pollutants get into stormwater, and what we can do to stop them from getting into the water.
Excellent. A very interesting trajectory. And I am curious about this trajectory of yours in terms of, you started studying psychology. And then you shifted and you started to study biology and environmental sciences.
Mhm.
So this trajectory seems to be very pragmatic and like diverse, and I also am a person who likes diversity, so I'm curious always to ask people who I interview, like what motivated you to study something else, like why did you decide to study environmental sciences?
Honestly, I've always been kind of interested in it. I think in grade school, I learned about recycling and composting, and I pushed my parents to do that. And I've always been interested in the connection of human beings and what we do and how that affects our environment. But in college, I was not for my undergrad. I don't feel like I was prepared to study biology because I once I started, it was a little hard for me, and so I wasn't honestly quite sure that I could do it at that time. But after I got my psychology degree and worked in different things, I still had the interest and decided to go back and try it when I was a little bit older. And I took to it more. I worked harder and it was a lot easier then. So not that it was easy, but I worked hard and got, you know.
Impressive, because you're right. At the age of 19 or 20, when we start our undergraduate degrees, we're not really quite sure what shall we study or what major to choose. And I absolutely identify with that point, because I faced the same issue 5 years ago
Mhm.
when I was choosing my majors. Um, I would like to hear, from you, what do you think about the notion of One Health in general?
I think it is a very important concept because a lot of people don't understand the the connection between what they do and what they put out into the environment, and how that can affect our health and the health of various animal species and the health of the environment itself. So, yeah, I think it's very important to work with children and adults to make that connection, because once you make that connection and people know that what they do can affect their own health and the health of everything around them. I think that's a very important connection to alter some of their maybe not so healthy patterns.
Indeed. And like as far as I know, you were part of the One Health Lessons program organized by Dr. Thompson in 2018. Like,
Mhm.
how was your experience during that program?
It was a great experience. I enjoy working with children in general, and we worked with third graders in some of the high school, or I'm sorry, the grade schools in the Bay Area, the San Francisco Bay Area, and it it was really great to see, like throughout the lesson, how the children um, how it helped them understand that what they did, and they seemed excited about it. We played a couple different games, and I think that made it fun for them and interesting to learn. And yeah, we saw some children just really, it just seemed to connect with them, and they seemed excited to go home and tell their family and doing what they can to help out. So I thought it was a great experience.
Indeed, I absolutely agree with you. Working with children, it is perhaps the most interesting transition in the life of adults, because they, for instance, imagine that once they were kids and how their parents were acting with them. So now, once they're themselves adults, they are trying, to teach kids in a totally different and interactive and pedagogical, interesting way. So definitely, the One Health lessons are very, very pedagogical, and sometimes they let us understand us peculiar notions, like the notions of mutations, for instance. And we study in the class of biology, very technical terms that not always in the fifth or sixth grade are easy to learn, I will say. Indeed. And so perhaps we can now talk a little bit more about water quality management, your field of expertise. For instance, I'm curious to know, how do we determine the level of contaminants in the water? Like, what are the different pathways that basically contaminate um, um, the waterways?
Yeah, so what I focus on is basically stormwater management. And stormwater is a major pathway for contaminants to get into the water, because stormwater is basically when it rains, rainfall, either if the surface is like a wooded area, a lot of times that rain will absorb into the ground. But in most urban areas, a lot of that has been paved over. And you've got a bunch of buildings, you have streets, you have sidewalks, and that water can't infiltrate into the ground anymore. So you see, I don't know if you guys have storm drains there, or what your system is there, but we have storm drains on the side of roads. So rainwater falls because it can't infiltrate into the ground. It flows over all these surfaces, all these man-made surfaces, and goes into a storm drain. Well, the storm drains were originally made to get water out of cities, and they weren't concerned with contaminants and what that water might pick up on the way to our waterways. They just wanted to get water out so it didn't flood the cities. Well, now, since those storm drains all go directly to our waterways, the stormwater picks up metals, nutrients, any number of contaminants, and just basically dumps those out to our waterways. So it's very important for people not to dump anything down there, or even if they have a leaky vehicle, or they put too much fertilizer on their grass, that can all get into our waterways and provide and just cause major issues in our waters. So for testing that, um, there are several things. If you have, I know a big problem on the East Coast in the US is algal growths. So you can see that there are a lot of extra nutrients getting into the water because you can visually see these this algae just grow on top of the water. And that's problematic for any number of reasons. Basically, that covers the water surface. Sunlight cannot penetrate the water. Since that's covering the surface, then plants can't photosynthesize. So there's very little dissolved oxygen. Then you get these large scale fish kills. A lot of fish and life in the water starts dying. So you can visually see that that's an issue, but you can also you can collect samples and send them to a lab to test for levels of lead or antimony or arsenic or pesticides and basically anything you want to. You could send it to a lab to test for it.
Indeed, and sometimes like we study in high school or in middle school, basically that that there are bacteria in the water. Like for
Mhm.
instance, what are the most frequent type of bacteria that scientists or water quality specialists can find them in the water while they analyze that sample of water, basically?
Right. So because I look mostly at construction and industrial sites, I don't look too much at bacteria. We do have one site that I look at that we test for E. coli, fecal coliform, and total coliform because those are basically indicator bacterias. So they can indicate the sites that I test this at, they do have a lot of farmland in the area. Um, so it could be that basically the stormwater is running over the farmland and carrying fecal waste um, or carrying waste from the animals into the waterways. And so that's one of the main things that I look at. I'm sure there are other water quality specialists that look at other things, but there's also a lot of times wastewater treatment plants can have overflows, and so you can get human waste in our waterways too. So that's one of the main things that we look at out here.
I was wondering to know more, about the experience you get from while working in the construction and industrial sites. Like, for
Mhm.
instance, I have noticed, like, currently in Istanbul, especially during these last 4 or 5 years, they're renewing the buildings and there are construction fields everywhere almost. So,
Mhm.
like they take time while they install the waterways and the different tubes, etc., etc. So, like, what are the most interesting parts regarding this in your own in your own experience? Like, what can you tell us more about that?
Well, for construction sites specifically, they're one of the biggest issues with construction sites is that they're tearing up the ground. So once they do that, the water, depending on the ground surface, depending on the geology of it, but a lot of times water will just carry that mud and dirt off the site. And a lot of things like metals and nutrients, they bind to that sediment. So that's another pathway of some pollutants getting into our waterways is that they're bound to sediment. So I guess that could be another way of seeing if there's potential contaminants, is that if there's a bunch of sediment in the water. Um, so what we do is in California, there's called a construction general permit. So all sites larger than an acre need to basically abide by certain rules, and they're not allowed to discharge or allow their site to discharge any sediment. So we we help them figure out what type of BMPs, which is best management practices, which can be any number of things, but we help them figure out financially and due to what type of site they have, if there's a lot of hills or if it's really flat, what the best things that they can do to prevent that sediment from running off and getting into our waterways. So we have a lot of things like fiber rolls, which is basically just a bunch of straw rolled up into a 9 or 10 inch roll. And if your site is very flat, Usually you can dig a little trench, install those around the edge of your site, and that can help filter any water that's coming off your site. Um, there are of course requirements with how how much you have to have of that and where you have to have them. If you have really steep hillsides, you might have to actually cover that with some sort of material so that water can't even hit it and flow down, because it can be very hard to protect your slopes, your steep slopes, um, so that they don't just wash away and dump into our waterways. So we try to help companies with that so that they can abide by the permit.
Of course, yes, it is very, very crucial to, to always to determine the exact conditions and requirements that specialists and scientists, that water specialists and scientists will basically impose as, as requirements and conditions for the workers to, to really apply. So basically, I think that one also of one of your jobs is also, like supervising, the work of the other specialists. And we often say that stagnant water is not good for drinking, and basically, especially while we are in school, they tell us this. And also, if you can tell us more about, testing lead in water, like as a water pollutant. Basically, or briefly, what can you tell us about water pollutants such as lead or other toxins?
Well, it's funny, we actually, my company, I haven't worked much on this project, but my company does go into a lot of the schools, hundreds of schools we've gone into and tested their water to see if there's lead in their water. And we've, the source, the municipal district that provides the water, they test their water all the time and have not found lead in it. But with aging infrastructure, pipes getting older, a lot of lead can leach out from those pipes. So what we've done is we go into schools very early in the morning, at least an hour before anybody else is there. We have the night before, we would have people cover all of the water spigots that we want to test so that nobody uses it, because you want the water to be sitting there for at least 8 to 12 hours. We go in very early in the morning, collect samples of that water, and send it off to the lab to test. And what we found at some of the schools is lead contamination at sometimes dangerous levels in some of those water spigots, sometimes drinking fountains. And usually it's not at all of them. So that indicates that you just need to change out that water fountain, or maybe change out some of the pipes for that, because that's the source of the lead. But you can see lead sources alongside highways a lot of times, because it comes off of vehicles if there's a lot of busy roadways, and that can deposit on the sediment next to the roadways. And if that sediment, if there isn't vegetation on top of that holding that sediment in place, that can wash away into our waterways too. There's also lead from, a lot of buildings used to be painted with lead-based paint. So that flakes off onto the ground and can wash into our waterways too. So I think there's a lot of sources of lead and other metals in general too.
Indeed, and it is very, very interesting, like um, often I mean, we know that nowadays our oceans are very polluted with plastics and different type of toxins and etc. etc. So, recently they started, I think it was a project in California where you live, or in the region of California. They started making or promoting the work of some industries that create ships basically that are cleaning the plastics or that are gathering the plastic in one place. It looks like an aspiring machine at the same time, but um, and it is one effective way to clean a specific area. But I think, like cleaning a whole ocean with that type of of ships, it will maybe take years, or and also it is very expensive. Like companies need to invest. So, and how can, in your opinion, how can we relate this to One Health for the future? Like when we see One Health perspective for the future, do you think that this project, this type of project, can be one of the effective ways that will perhaps to some extent save the harmony of our planet and the quality of our waterways as well to some extent?
Yeah, I think that's a great project. I think it is very helpful and would take years. Um, but I think the best thing and how to relate it back to One Health is for it not to make its way into the oceans in the first place. To basically create practices. Um, I try my best not to buy anything made of plastic. I try to look at the clothing that I buy and make sure that sometimes it's made from recycled materials and that they're doing their best not to contribute more pollutants to the air, the water, anywhere. Um, but I think, yeah, I think the way that can relate to One Health is to, especially since it takes so long to clean all of that up.
Absolutely.
Um, yeah, and also not only yeah, not only is that stuff in the ocean, just cleaning that up, there's stuff that leaches out of that that are it's unseen contaminants that gets into our water too. So yeah, I think maybe connecting that with people in using less plastic and composting things as much as they can, um, and especially in America, less consume less, buy less. Like there's so many things that we don't need and it just gets thrown away. Buy stuff that's reusable. Um, find better ways to dispose of our trash. Right now it's buried in landfills. Well, there's going to be a limit to that, how much we can do that.
Indeed.
Um, so it may be helping people understand what that's doing to our ecosystem because all those plastics, all that trash gets into our ecosystem. Turtles eat it, birds eat it, any number of species eat it, and their stomach is full of that, so they can't actually consume food. So they die, and that can be, people don't understand when certain species die off, how much that can impact the rest of our ecosystem. Um,
There is
if
some
you,
balance that can't be controlled
Mhm.
spontaneously, but can be controlled, by creating an awareness and also convincing. I think that to some extent, also, it is very important to convince the policymakers or the
Mhm.
legislators to implement some more rigorous policies that we know, like, will determine the scope of or the extent of pollution in terms, like for instance in France, I know that if you cut one tree, you have to plant two more. Like,
Nice.
I think it's a very efficient policy in this term. So we also, I think we should reach out to legislators because they are the ones who make the policies.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I know a similar thing here is you cannot destroy wetland areas without creating an area of equal or larger size because wetlands are major places for various species to spawn and grow. So yeah, if you destroy one thing, you have to create it elsewhere.
Absolutely, we need we need to create awareness and perhaps these talks that we are making and conducting all over this period, perhaps to some extent, will create that level of consciousness. So, like, because I think that while I was living in France, I noticed that, composting, recycling are very important process. It's a very important process. In Turkey, in some places, not everywhere, but in Macedonia, not at all. So,
Yeah.
like for instance, it's really, I think that in terms of development, sometimes, for instance, the European Union and the Agency for Development in the Western Balkan countries. They need to have more effective cooperation in terms of these policies, because I remember when I was a child, the mountains were full with trees. Now the mountains are empty. There are no longer trees because people are illegally cutting trees, etc., etc. So this is a very problematic issue for the Balkan region and for many other regions in the world, not just for the Balkan. Indeed. Thank you a lot for this fabulous conversation today. I really learned a lot, even notions that I didn't know. And thank you very much for your contribution about this. And thank you for promoting One Health as a concept and also the work of One Health lessons.
Of course, thank you. Thank you for the opportunity. It was very nice talking to you.
Thank you a lot and take care of yourself and talk to you soon.
Okay, thanks.